Do you ever just wake up some days and just say, I'm gonna do a lot? Okay. Hello, my bookos. Welcome to Book Hoarding by Bianca. I'm Bianca, and I had a pretty shitty birthday weekend. But to combat that, I'm going to sit here in my flower crown and my newly made dress, which might clash, but I don't care. Today's DIY is going to be me tracing a fun vintage dress that I got while thrifting many weekends back when I actually went on a nice little vacation. I'm hoping that this will be the first of maybe a few knits centered videos that I sprinkle out. I want to do more knits things for folks since I know I've gotten questions about that before, but specifically this is just going over the basics of how you trace like a kind of 1 or 2 piece garment and make a pattern from it. Obviously this is not that complicated, but I hope it's a starting point for folks. I just wanted to show how I can trace a thing off and how you can use that to add seam allowance and add other pieces. I also use this as a stash buster. I had this metallic pumpkin fabric that I got from my local dead stock place, Fabrics in San Francisco, that I've been sitting on for many years because it's just like funky and cool, but like what are you gonna do with it? And I got this dress and I was just like, yeah, let's go funky, full funky with this. And I did. And I also added a hood that I call my Leia hood because it's just a strip of fabric. And in the video that you are going to watch in 2 seconds, you'll see what I mean by that. But it's basically just a strip of fabric that you pleat in the back and then you can pull up as a little dramatic hood, which isn't gonna work well with my flower crown. Maybe it's fine, actually. Why did I have a crappy birthday weekend, you ask? Well, you see, I named harm that had been done by a Jane Austen organization, and people didn't like that. They never like it. I start graduate school this week, so if you see maybe less of me, maybe a skosh less of me, probably because of that, I'm gonna try to do like a mix of content and video diaries to make up for the fact that I will probably be very busy and tired and world weary. With that, I guess let's get into the DIY and out of my nihilistic streak. Today we are going to be tracing this cool shirt dress that I got at a vintage shop in Southern California. It's like 80s, 90s-ish, and it's made from a knit fabric. So I'm going to trace this off and I'm going to show you basically how to trace a pattern that you like. This is a very simple dress. I hope to do more complicated ones in the future. But you're basically going to just fold it in half and try to have it as flat and as even as possible so it's symmetrical. And then you're going to use whatever paper that you're working on, make sure that's also flat and lined up as much as possible. Knit is a little bit more forgiving, so I'm not as concerned about certain parts of this, but I am doing a first round marking on here. You could use tracing stuff under this. Or if you put this on top of cardboard or a cutting mat, you could put a tracing wheel, and I hope to show those techniques in the future. But this is just me trying to show you that you basically just trace the piece. I'm lucky in that this is all one piece. There are no seams except for the sleeve, the sides and the sleeve. So for a more complicated piece, you'd have to kind of individually do this, and I hope to show you more about that in the future, but for now here's just the basics. So I'm going to stop there because the cuff is a rib knit, and I'm just going to pull that cuff back and make that line. I'll be adding seam allowance to that later, but that's a similar thing that you can do for your knit garments if that's a thing that you're interested in. They're a little finicky, knit versus woven, but for this, I think the biggest thing is that knit stuff doesn't have darts, so I don't have to worry about inserting all that and sizing and all that around a dart. My little cheat for the collar, instead of making 2 patterns for a dress that's the same on both sides, is to just pull the collar back and trace back the inner and outer collar. So the back collar piece is usually higher and the front collar is usually lower for your neck, and I made the little mark there. Next up is actually going through with real rulers and fixing my lines. So you saw me do a cursory look and now I'm pulling that up and it's a little wonky, right? So we're going to take all of our rulers and an actual pencil and make nicer lines. That center line we know needs to be, because it's on a fold, we know it needs to be perfect. So we're going to focus on that one first. And you're just going to go through and make a perfect line and get it lined up well. And I'm sorry that the bottom of this dress is cut off from the camera. I did try to frame this well, but it's a small floor, small San Francisco apartment. So we're doing what we can. Also, I typically have tried to skew away from doing floor patterning things for the sake of my back, but because this piece was much bigger than my table, oh, there's my high. Because this piece was so much bigger than my table, I did need to move it this way. My dining room table is also filled with class supplies for the semester, so I couldn't use that. Anyway, so that center line is going to be what that is. And so now I'm using a hip curve, inverted, to just smooth out that batwing line. So again, this is a batwing sleeve. All of this is a very forgiving pattern. I highly suggest for your first pattern that you're tracing off, just using a t-shirt, something very, very simple, and just trace it off. I like to do it halfway so it's not a full pattern, and then just making all of those lines carefully and slowly. Like you can see here, I'm going to spend some time deciding which side of the ruler to use for parts of this. I know it's off camera, but like you'll get to see me up close redo the bottom of that later. And so you can see I have a ton of rulers. Now, if you don't have French curves, I will include a link to French curves in that printable free French curves in my description. And the other thing I suggest is if you have curvy things around your house, use that. So like pots, bowls, plates, those are all things with curves. Like they're not going to be like the French curve exactly, but just an FYI, those are things that you can use around your house. Now again, I'm using the inverted French curve or the inverted hip curve to make this a nicer, smoother line. Because I know it should be a smooth line, right? Like this was not patterned to be a jagged thing. I know it's going to be smooth. So I'm just going over that. I know it's pencil, so you can't see. But I am just taking my time to go over all of the initial lines, smooth those out, and create a better guideline, essentially, to make the pattern off of. So you can see there, that line was a straight, funky line, and now I'm going to add seam allowance. So I'm adding 1/2 inch. For knit things, for seam allowance, you can do whatever you want. So, and when I say that, I mean, some people serge off just a little bit. Some people don't have a serger. They're going to be using an overlocking zigzag stitch on their machine. My advice to you is whatever you know you're going to be doing, that is a seam allowance you need to put, and then you need to put that seam allowance on your pattern when you've made it. So like it's interesting because the collar for this isn't a ribbed collar, it's just the knit was folded down. So I am just going to put like a little bit in there. But if you are making this for your own thing and you know that like it needs a little rib knit there or something, just factor that in, you know, like you wouldn't trace off that entire collar if it's rib knit. You would just trace off the collar to where the regular jersey or whatever knit it is ends. And again, I really want to do more videos on this. I just hope this like really basic example of how to do this is fun. And I'm going to keep these 2 colors on here. So I will show you later in this video how I maintain 2 collars on one pattern. And this only works for patterns that are the same front and back essentially. And that's really only knit stuff because of the darts and the dart placement. There are no darts in knitwear that I've seen, at least. I mean, I'm sure they exist. There's no absolute, you know, like what is an absolute for anything? But typically there's no darts in knits. There are probably seams in your knits though, and that is something to think about. And I'll try to do a more complicated project soon so you see this, but then I'm just adding seam allowance here. So I know from looking at the garment, like this, adding these seam allowances and everything is also going to mean looking at your garment a lot and knowing where are the seams. I have to add allowance to every single line of that because it's going to be sewn to something. How long do you want your hem to be? Is it folded over once or twice? Is it serged and then folded over once, or is it folded over twice? And those are things you need to make sure you put in there when you're doing it. And also, again, leaving those notes on your pattern so that you have it. So I am just freehanded connecting my 1/2 inch seam allowance lines. So I know I'm going to serge off 1/2 inch because the serger is going to cut that off. Versus if you're using a machine, it's going to be a little different, right? Great. So this is the kind of bottom part that was hard to see. And this is like a kind of not hip, it starts with like the calf. It's like just an open side split, not a seam necessarily. So this is all a hem. And you can see I'm going to start putting in the actual lines. And I just have a little bit there that's missing. It just was off that paper by a little bit. So I'm going to put in my lines here, and then I'm just going to quickly add a scrap piece of paper and get some tape and just tape it in. I do tend to keep my scrap pieces of patterning paper that are like maybe postcard size and bigger, I guess, is like, much like the scrap rule for fabric. Just because there are going to be little bits that sometimes it just comes really in handy. And I'm sorry you can't see this and my head's in the way. But I'm basically using that hip curve to redraw the rest of that line. You can see there. Because I did use the hip curve to draw the line initially too, despite the missing piece. And so yeah, I just finished that in and used that piece of paper to do that. And then I just need to cut around it. I'm just evening it up just a little bit. Things can get funky when you start layering paper and like get a little like wonky. Okay, fabric is folded. I know I need a lengthy piece of this fabric because this is a long pattern. I think I use like 3 yards, and I got this Halloween fabric many years ago. So with all this stuff, make sure you're using a flat surface. You can see me putting my hands on it just to make sure there's no wrinkling happening under it, because this fabric is very flowy. A lot of knit stuff is going to probably be that way, so you just want to always make sure there's no wrinkling happening. Now I know that has to go on the fold, and I'm just going to, this is longer than I initially anticipated when I made the initial fold, so I'm just going to pull that down, make sure that's halfway, and then these are my pattern weights. So at least for floor stuff, I'll say my pattern weights are just these American Dash shoes that I got on a sale site a while ago because they were so cute, and this was before their re-release. Anyway, so then you cut around it. You should probably pin if you're not comfortable. I had a problem with this metallic pumpkin stuff with pins going through that, so I didn't. But use weights and pins where needed. Okay, so I cut this with the high back collar. Now it's time for me to do the magic that I do, which is not magic, it's just me not wanting to have 2 massive patterns. I cut that, and then I just fold it down so that line is center line. Ta-da! That's the collar. That's the collar situation. Just fold it down, and you can see the shoe is on top of it, and I just cut it out. And that's how I know the front and the back. So I have the one pattern. I feel like that only really works with knits. Okay, so now we're on to the fun little arm, the cuff, the gauntlet cuff, because it's a little bit longer than a regular one. So you're going to measure it. Obviously, you're going to double the width. This is rib knit. And so I have a black rib knit, which goes great because I'm working with the black and orange Halloween fabric. And that is a rib knit on that sleeve cuff. And what I'm going to do is, fold it and serge it in. And I'm just kind of working with it to see, like, does this feel like it's going to work nicely? I am not in this video going to get into stretch, like logistics. Like, is it 50% stretch or is it 70% stretch? Like, that's a whole different thing. But I will tell you, like, if you look at this, you see the little ribbing. That's how you can tell a rib knit. Those lines. Those very distinct lines, so that when you pull them apart, that's how it looks. And so you can see there, that's the rib knit. If you have a t-shirt that has that, it's usually around the collar. This does not have it, it's on the cuff. Anyway, so first you're going to sew for this dress, if you're making something similar, the shoulder seam. If you're doing like legit knit stuff, you would probably actually add in a stabilizer for that, but I did not because this is a very casual slinky thing. If you pin your serged pieces, your serger works all over that last inch of your fabric. So you can pin your stuff, because I had to pin this because it's very slinky and slippery. You just need to pin it farther out than your serger is going to cut or the feed dogs are going to be. Okay, so that shoulder seam is in. The rib knit I cut to the size I needed. I'm only pinning it at the top because it's going to stretch. I'm going to manually stretch that to fit that entire sleeve, if that makes sense. So the first thing you're going to do is take it to your serger, and then you're going to, that first little bit, you're just going to serge it down. Now this is a folded gauntlet. I know black on black is really hard to see, but I'm just lining that up on that sleeve, and I'm just going to serge in that first little bit so it's attached. And then you can see I am now stretching that rib knit, because rib knit is very forgiving. I'm stretching it all the way down to the end of that. So despite that rib knit initially actually being shorter than that, the end of that cuff, I stretch it out, and that's how you're going to make that gauntlet cuff, as I'm calling it, because it's very interesting. So you can see there, now it's attached. Yay! Look at that, it's nice. Now, this is just one big seam. There's very little sewing in this. This is why I like this dress. So I'm just going to do the side seam. And again, the pins are far out because you don't want to serge over a pin. If you do serge over a pin, I suggest doing the fine fabric, like silk pins, because my blade will just cut that. It's very dangerous. I don't suggest doing that, but I will say it doesn't break my blade. As someone who's accidentally done it a couple times. But yeah, please, if you do use pins, keep them far out. Clips are also fine. I just found for this really slippery fabric, clips were not necessarily staying. They were kind of weighing stuff down. So I just put the pins far out and spaced farther than you probably want to for your first projects if you're not very confident and stuff. You can see here, just you're finishing that cuff. You get to it, and I've just folded that once over. Yeah. I guess these are inline sleeves and cuffs, if you will, because they're just in the line of the side of your thing. Alright, so this is look number 1 with just sewing the actual dress pattern. I love the gauntlets. I love how long they are. I love the Batwing. I love this very silly Halloween fabric that I got at my local dead stock place. But I want to add one thing. I'm going to add a hood to this. And it's not really like a hood. It is essentially a vintage / it's how Leia's hood is. It's just a strip of fabric. I will put the measurements in my description, but it's 44 by 15. I'm going to serge the edges of the strip of fabric, and then I'm just going to attach it to the back. It is just a long strip of fabric. There's one overlap I have in the center back, and then you just pleat it along the edges of the collar as close to the front as you want it to be. You can see here the final thing. You can see that's the quote hood, and there's a middle part there, which is the other side of the strip of fabric. That's it. That's how I made my cute little vintage inspired hood. It is again the exact hood that you use for Leia if you're making the Leia A New Hope costume. I think the Jedi Leia, Marvel Leia is the same. I liked this as a fun thing. I tried it as like a front cowl situation. I thought that was kind of cute. It's also just fun as like a back kind of swoopy thing. It reminds me of a lot of vintage clothes. I did style this with a belt. But you can do whatever is comfy for you. Okay, so that's like a quick little DIY walkthrough on tracing a knit garment and also just basic construction of a basic knit garment. I know it was very fast and very basic. I do want to do more, and I hope that was fun for you. But also, I'm proud of myself for stash busting and for making something comfy and cozy for myself. Friends, I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for taking care of yourselves and your community, for standing up for people, for standing up against racism and sexism and homophobia. Like, y'all are great. Thank you for that. It's the minimum that anyone could do. But clearly, a lot of people aren't down to do the minimum. And I thank you for doing that. Thank you for being exemplary folks in a time where people are not actually exemplary, where people are actually very hateful and lash out and rude instead of just being accountable for their actions and accountable for the harm that they're participating in or doing. So I thank you. You know, that's very weird, but I do. I thank you for being here. Patrons, other folks, thank you again so much for like supporting monetarily right now, because I spent like easily $4,000 on school supplies this semester. Don't ask me why all those supplies were necessary and cost that much money. Thank you so much for joining me. Check out all the links in my descriptions and all that stuff. Man, I'm too tired to even know what I'm going to say. With that, don't forget to make it so. I need a nap.